Retcons. If there's one thing I love doing when it comes to Ninjago is discussing them. I find them fascinating. I love trying to justify them. I love just looking into these details and seeing how they can be managed in an in-universe perspective. But sometimes you come across a retcon that is just simply unexplainable. One that just happens because why not, and it's just for the sake of it really. There is no meaningful reason for it to happen, and that is completely fine. At the end of the day, Ninjago is pretty well written, so I don't take a massive issue with it as long as I'm having a good time. But I will still make sure to document them, and I will still be sure to try and figure it out. And that is what I've done many times, but today I'm coming at you with one of the weirder ones that I have ever actually seen. One that I don't have a theoretical explanation for, because it's just truly that much of an anomaly. So let me take you on a small journey about a particular weapon. Let me show you a weapon and how it's been affected over the years, and try to figure out why this retcon may have happened. There are some ideas, but in terms of an in-universe one, there isn't really. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as we talk about one of Ninjago's weirder retcons, being the nunchucks of lightning. Our story starts off fairly standard, just being the fact that the nunchucks of lightning were introduced in the pilot and existed as they were. We got to see this iconic design, two dragon hilts coming together by a lightning bolt. Honestly, one of my favourite designed weapons and one of the most unique as it has the most colour to it in comparison to the rest. And this stayed fairly standard for all accounts. Between the pilot's season 1 and its few appearances in season 2, that was basically it. The design always remained consistent, and a fantastic one at that. Honestly, I really just like how these weapons look. And, you know, for reference, and not really something I'm going to bring up in this video, these are the most used ones I have in Fortnite. But the weapons were eventually destroyed and made into the golden armor, which was fine, and there was nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But come season 10 or March of the Oni, we got to see Kai take the golden armor and reforge them back into weapons. And we got the one that you can see on screen now. And there is one very distinct difference between them, being the fact that the lightning no longer comes out of the dragon's mouth and comes out of the underside. Now, on its own, this is fine. This isn't a retcon by any account, because this is just how Kai reforged the weapons. They are having slight alterations like many of the weapons actually did have. The only ones that came out basically the same was the sword and the shurikens, so I don't see a problem with that whatsoever. This was also to keep in line with what we actually got within the sets, being the new dragon hilt being on the underside, so this completely worked and it actually makes sense within the context of the story. But eventually the weapons were depowered. The weapons no longer had their elemental ability and they were stored away by Wu, which is where the issue starts to come into play. Because the weapon was reintroduced in crystallized, and by all accounts nothing had actually changed between March of the Oni and then. They were merely put away by Wu. Now, apart from very small design changes on all of the weapons because of the change of animation studio, the nunchucks of lightning actually received a complete retcon here. Like I said, in March of the Oni, the lightning was actually emitting from the bottom circular piece of the nunchucks themselves. Like I said, to just coincide with the Lego set. But it seems to be that the weapon actually went back to having the lightning come out of the dragon's mouth. This comes from the fact that Pythor holds them in an upright position, and so does Jay towards the end of the season. It seems to be that everything is pointing to the idea that the lightning was coming out of the other end. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was just a case of Pythor and Jay were just holding the weapons the wrong side round. Maybe it's just that simple of an explanation. Well, no. If you look really closely, you can see that when the weapons are corrupted, and even when the weapon wasn't at the very end of crystallized, you can see that the lightning is emitting from the dragon's mouth. Now, if we look at how the weapons were formulated when it does come to before, you can see that there is a hole in the bottom circular end of the nunchuck for the lightning, and that is still there in some shots, but the lightning is just coming out of the other side. This, by all accounts, is a retcon. This makes no sense, and it shouldn't be able to be the case, because if lightning is able to come out both sides, they wouldn't really be nunchucks, would they? So it seems to be that the weapon is on the other side, but maybe this is just crystallized being crystallized, and this is a complete one-off. Well, no, it isn't. Because since then the nunchucks have made two other appearances in some form of capacity, one being the Dreams collaboration. Now, for the most part, we actually don't see lightning when it does come between the two hilts, unless Jay does use lightning abilities. They do come out of the dragon's mouth in this moment, but the thing is that you could just attribute that to elemental power. There is nothing really stating that that is going to be the case. But the more damning one actually comes from the 15th anniversary weekend whip, where in every single shot where you actually see the nunchucks of lightning, you see lightning come out of the dragon's mouth. So it seems to be that the lightning nunchucks now are just quite simply changing their tune. They have gone back to how they originally were, which is a retcon. It is a complete change in how the weapons function. It is a complete difference in how we saw Kyrie forge them in that moment, to the point where in some shots, like I said, you do still see the opening on the circular end for the lightning, but in other shots it is now just completely removed. So they've changed it, and it does beg the question as to why. Like with most things, there is always an out-of-universe explanation as to why this may simply be the case. Now, there are two out-of-universe reasons when it does come to this. The first one, nostalgia. Of course, the nunchucks of lightning were based on the original nunchucks from way back when, and Crystallize has done a lot in terms of bringing back older things when it does come to Ninjago, and one of those could very simply just be the nunchucks of lightning, changing it back to its original variant to strike more of a callback when it does come to the nunchucks in the original sense. This is a near enough universal explanation for anything. This has been done a lot with the golden weapons in recent time, again citing the Fortnite collaboration as a reasoning. They changed the scythe back to the longer hilt that we originally actually had. Of course, they have made some other alterations in terms of how they design the weapons, but in terms of just having a callback to how Ninjago originally was, that is going to be the case. And again, the nunchucks are proof of this, because in the Fortnite collaboration, they are basically one for one with the original design, just with a bit more blue. But the other out-of-universe explanation as to why this is the case, it does just come down to the change of animation studio. When WildBrain did receive everything that they needed when it did come to Ninjago, and they learned they had to redesign the golden weapons in their own art form, they tried their best to go into what they actually saw when it does come to the golden weapons, but the thing is that their reference material and everything surrounding it could very easily have just been based around nunchucks of lightning that did look like they did go the other way. For example, if you do look at the very last shot when it does come to the golden weapons in the Oni trilogy, you can see that the nunchucks are deactivated. There is no real indication as to where the lightning might actually come from. Of course, it is implied by how they are laid out, but that is actually about it. But beyond that, any sort of reference of the nunchucks probably came from earlier material where it does come out of the dragon's mouth. So it very easily could just be someone at WildBrain interpreting it as the original design instead of the renewed one. It makes sense, but ultimately it is still just the case on where it could be. But like everything with the Weavy channel, I always do try to link it back to some form of in-universe explanation. I try to call it back in some sort of sense and to make it work within Ninjago's lore, which is annoying because it is very difficult to, but I do have a very loose way of interpreting how it could actually be the case, and that comes down to the Overlord's influence on the weapon. Now, we see the Overlord corrupt the golden weapons and change them to actually suit the Crystal Council's needs, and of course, one of the main things that go into it is actually making a link between the two hilts of the nunchucks of lightning. They were completely separate pieces, and the Overlord needed to re-bridge the gap. Now, if we look at it from that form of perspective, the Overlord could have done one of two things. For one, if the nunchucks were positioned upright so the dragon hilts were moving upwards like Pythor remembers, it could just be simply a case of the Overlord's destruction powers just working with how the weapons were laid out, in accordance with Pythor's memory. On the other hand, this could be down to the Overlord's memory. The Overlord has had his plan for a very long time, and he would remember the golden weapons as how he saw it with the first Spinjitzu Master, which had the lightning coming out of the dragon's mouth. Again, making complete sense as to why it would be emanating from that position instead of the other one. But I do think just the unfortunate explanation is just that they wanted to change it to make the nunchucks look like how they used to. I think that is just the real way of looking at it. In reality, that WildBrain wouldn't have been able to miss the fact that the nunchucks were coming out of the other side. That is just that, because they had to design the weapons based on that version of the nunchucks. They changed it because it just invoked more of a nostalgia-based purpose. And that is a massive shame, but ultimately it is just the case at the end of the day. And I don't think it is bad whatsoever, and it actually does open up a much larger question, because how come they didn't change anything about the other weapons? Well, they actually did. They made the shurikens bigger, they made the scythe smaller, they made the sword thinner. The thing is that all of the weapons went for alterations. This one is just the most apparent of the bunch. And like I said, there is nothing wrong with that whatsoever, but it's just simply a retcon to line up with what they deem to be a more nostalgic version of the nunchucks. But on an overall, there is not an issue with this whatsoever. It's a design choice and I respect it regardless. I do think the nunchucks do look a lot better with the lightning coming out of the dragon's mouth, but that is just me. But I do wish they did continue on with what was actually set out when it did come to Season 10. But ultimately it doesn't matter, and I've given an explanation to something that no one's probably thought about but me, because I just pay too much attention to this show. But I would love to know, do you prefer the nunchucks of lightning with the lightning coming out of the dragon's end or the circular end? It is such a specific question that I'm hoping only I am actually caring about, but I do think I've cultivated an audience that pays too much attention to Ninjago like me. But there's nothing wrong with that. We can just all continue to answer the most useless Ninjago questions possible and have a lot of fun doing so. So let me know, do you prefer the nunchucks of lightning how they were before or how they are now? I would love to know what you think and whether you think this will continue to stick, because it seems like it is, but like always, I would love to know what you do think. But thank you very much for watching the video, and I do hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider subscribing. I love discussing Ninjago with more people. And if you do want to support the channel any further, which you do not have to, you could always become a channel member and join the legends that you see on screen. Each of your support means the absolute world to me, and I truly cannot thank you enough. But like I said, that's about it for today, and take care. Okay,